Sarah Mitchell walked into the corporate boardroom with her shoulders straight and her head held high. At 35, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that some people mistook for arrogance. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a basic navy blazer over dark jeans. Nothing about her appearance screamed military background, which was exactly how she preferred it. The marketing firm where she now worked as a senior consultant had called an all-hands meeting. Rumors had been swirling for weeks about budget cuts and possible layoffs. As employees filed into the glass-walled conference room, nervous chatter filled the air. Sarah found a seat near the back, observing the worried faces around her. She had been with Henderson Marketing Group for 3 years now, ever since she left her previous life behind. Her colleagues knew her as the quiet woman who always delivered exceptional work, never missed deadlines, and somehow remained calm under the most stressful situations. What they didn't know was that before she became Sarah the marketing consultant, she was Petty Officer Sarah Mitchell, one of only a handful of women to complete Navy SEAL training. The transition from military to civilian life had been harder than any physical challenge she faced during SEAL training. In the military, your credentials were worn on your sleeve, literally. Your rank, your specializations, your achievements were all visible. In the corporate world, she learned quickly that talking about her military background made people uncomfortable. Some didn't believe her. Others treated her differently, like she was some kind of exotic animal in a zoo, so she stopped mentioning it altogether. Her supervisor, Janet Walsh, had introduced her to new clients for 3 years as Sarah Mitchell, one of our most dedicated consultants, never mentioning the 8 years of military service, the classified operations, or the fact that Sarah had literally jumped out of planes into hostile territory. It was easier that way, Sarah told herself. Less complicated. But sometimes, in moments like these, sitting in a room full of people panicking about job security, Sarah felt the weight of her hidden identity. She watched her coworker Brad Chen fidgeting with his pen, his usual confident demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. Across the table, Maria Santos kept checking her phone, probably calculating her mortgage payments against potential unemployment benefits. These were good people, hard-working people, but they had never faced the kind of life-or-death pressure that Sarah knew intimately. They had never had to rely on their training and instincts to survive situations where failure meant not just losing a job, but losing their life or the lives of their teammates. The company's CEO, Robert Henderson, entered the room with his usual theatrical flair. He was a man who loved being the center of attention, someone who dominated every conversation and never seemed to run out of stories about his college football days. Behind him walked the entire executive team, their faces wearing the practiced neutral expressions that usually meant bad news. "Good morning, everyone," Henderson began, his voice booming across the room. "I know there have been a lot of rumors flying around, and I want to address them head-on." Sarah noticed how he paused dramatically, enjoying the suspense he was creating. In her military days, briefings were direct and to the point. Lives depended on clear, concise communication. But in the corporate world, everything seemed to be about performance and drama. "The truth is, we're facing some challenges," Henderson continued. "Our biggest client, Meridian Electronics, has decided to take their business elsewhere. This represents about 40% of our annual revenue." A collective intake of breath filled the room. Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. She had learned long ago not to react emotionally to bad news until she had all the facts. "Now, I want everyone to know that we're exploring all options," Henderson said, raising his hands as if to calm the room. "But I won't lie to you. We're going to have to make some tough decisions in the coming weeks." Janet Walsh raised her hand. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" "We have about 6 weeks to either replace that revenue or—" Henderson let the sentence hang in the air. "Or what?" Brad asked, his voice tight with worry. "Or we'll have to consider significant downsizing." The room erupted in worried murmurs. Sarah watched as her colleagues began whispering among themselves, faces pale with concern. She understood their fear. For most of them, this job was their primary source of income, their career identity, their security blanket. But Sarah had faced uncertainty before. She had been in situations where she didn't know if she would see the next sunrise. She had learned to compartmentalize fear, to focus on solutions rather than problems, to maintain operational effectiveness even when the stakes were impossibly high. I know this is scary, Henderson continued, trying to regain control of the room. But I want everyone to think creatively. If anyone has ideas for how we can replace this revenue or cut costs without losing people, I'm open to suggestions. The room fell silent. Sarah could practically feel the wheels turning in everyone's heads, but fear had a way of shutting down creative thinking. People were too worried about their own survival to think strategically about the company's problems. Then Maria Santos spoke up. What about that government contract opportunity we heard about last month? The one for the Department of Defense? Henderson's expression shifted slightly. That's actually a possibility we've been exploring. But it's incredibly competitive. The RFP requires experience with military protocols, security clearances, and frankly, an understanding of how the Defense Department operates that I'm not sure we have. Sarah felt a familiar stirring in her chest. She knew exactly what Henderson was talking about. DoD contracts were lucrative but notoriously difficult for civilian companies to navigate. The bureaucracy was complex, the security requirements were stringent, and the cultural divide between military and civilian operations often proved insurmountable. Plus, Henderson added, they're specifically looking for firms with proven experience working with special operations units. That's not exactly our wheelhouse. Several people nodded in agreement. Henderson Marketing Group specialized in consumer products and technology companies. They created slick advertising campaigns and social media strategies. Military work was an entirely different animal. But Sarah knew that animal intimately. She found herself studying Henderson's face as he spoke. There was something he wasn't saying, some detail he was holding back. After years of reading people in high-stakes situations, Sarah had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when someone was concealing information. How big is the contract? She found herself asking. Henderson looked surprised that she had spoken up. Sarah rarely contributed to company-wide meetings, preferring to do her talking in smaller groups or one-on-one situations. It's substantial, he said carefully. A 3-year deal worth approximately $12 million. The room went quiet again. $12 million would not only replace the Meridian contract, but actually grow the company significantly. But like I said, Henderson continued, it's probably a long shot. The competition includes firms with decades of military experience. We'd be going up against companies that have former generals on their advisory boards. Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly, but her expression remained neutral. She was calculating odds, assessing possibilities, thinking through the tactical situation the same way she had learned to analyze potential missions. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with Henderson outlining various cost-cutting measures and efficiency improvements. But Sarah's mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the contract, about the company's chances, about the skills and experience sitting unrecognized in this very room. As the meeting broke up and people began filing out, Sarah lingered in her seat. She watched her colleagues leave, their conversations focused on updating resumes and networking contacts. They were already preparing for defeat, for the inevitable layoffs that seemed to be coming. But Sarah was thinking about victory. She had kept her military background hidden for 3 years, treating it like some embarrassing secret that might damage her civilian career. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding who she really was. Maybe it was time to tell them about the 8 years she spent in the Navy, about the grueling SEAL training that only 20% of candidates completed, about the classified operations she couldn't discuss, but that had taken her to some of the most dangerous places on Earth, about the skills in strategy, leadership, and crisis management that she had been quietly applying to marketing campaigns and client presentations. As she gathered her notebook and stood to leave, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She was going to talk to Henderson, but first she needed to do some research on that government contract. She needed to understand exactly what the Department of Defense was looking for, what kind of company they wanted to work with, and what it would take to win. Sarah Mitchell had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. It was time to come out of the shadows. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was quiet, with only the security guard and a few early arrivals scattered across the different floors. She made her way to her desk and immediately began researching the DoD contract opportunity. Using her still active security clearance and connections within the military community, Sarah was able to access information that would have been difficult for a typical marketing firm to obtain. What she discovered was both encouraging and daunting. The Department of Defense was specifically looking for a communications firm to handle outreach and recruitment for special operations units. They wanted someone who could create compelling content that would attract high-quality candidates while also managing sensitive public relations challenges that often arose around special ops missions. It was, Sarah realized, the perfect intersection of her military experience and her civilian skills. But winning the contract would require more than just submitting a proposal. The DoD wanted to see proven experience, demonstrated understanding of special operations culture, and most importantly, they wanted to meet the actual team members who would be working on the account. Sarah spent the morning crafting a detailed analysis of the opportunity. She outlined the specific requirements, identified the key decision-makers within the Defense Department, and developed a preliminary strategy for how Henderson Marketing Group could position itself as the ideal candidate. By lunchtime, she had created a 20-page presentation that was unlike anything the company had ever produced. Now came the hard part, convincing Henderson to listen to her. Sarah had always preferred to work behind the scenes. In the military, she had learned that effective operators often did their best work without fanfare or recognition. But winning this contract would require her to step into the spotlight, to reveal parts of herself that she had kept carefully hidden. She printed out her presentation and walked toward Henderson's corner office. His door was open, and she could see him on a conference call, his voice animated as he tried to convince someone not to cancel their contract. Sarah waited outside until the call ended, then knocked on the door frame. "Sarah," Henderson said, looking up from his computer. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to talk to you about the Department of Defense contract," she said, stepping into his office. Henderson leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "Sarah, I appreciate your interest, but like I said yesterday, it's probably not realistic for us to pursue. We just don't have the background for that kind of work." "Actually," Sarah said, closing the office door behind her, "I think you might be surprised." She placed her presentation on his desk and took a seat across from him. Henderson glanced at the document, then back at her, his eyebrows raised. "I did some research on the contract requirements," Sarah continued, "and I think Henderson Marketing Group might be exactly what they're looking for." "Sarah, I know you mean well, but did you know that special operations recruitment has been one of the military's biggest challenges for the past 5 years?" Sarah interrupted, her voice calm but confident. "Traditional recruiting methods aren't working. They need someone who understands both the military mindset and modern marketing techniques." Henderson paused, his attention now fully focused on her. "They're not looking for a company run by former generals," Sarah continued. "They're looking for people who can bridge the gap between military culture and civilian communications, people who have actually lived in both worlds." "And you think we have people like that?" Henderson asked. Sarah met his gaze directly. "We have at least one." There was something in her tone that made Henderson sit up straighter. For the first time since she had started working at the company, Sarah was speaking with the quiet authority that had once commanded respect from Navy SEALs and Defense Department officials. "What aren't you telling me, Sarah?" Sarah took a deep breath. After 3 years of hiding, after 3 years of being just another marketing consultant, she was about to reveal who she really was. "Before I worked here," she said, "I spent 8 years in the Navy. I was a SEAL." Henderson stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he started to smile. "Sarah," he said, "I appreciate creativity, but—" "I'm not being creative," Sarah said firmly. "I'm telling you the truth." The smile faded from Henderson's face as he realized she was completely serious. "You're telling me that you, Sarah Mitchell, from our marketing department, used to be a Navy SEAL?" Sarah could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to reconcile the quiet woman he thought he knew with the claim she was making. "Sarah, no offense, but you don't exactly fit the profile." Sarah had heard variations of this response many times before. People had preconceived notions about what a Navy SEAL should look like, how they should act, how they should present themselves. The reality was often very different from the Hollywood stereotypes. "What profile would that be?" she asked calmly. "You know, bigger, more aggressive, more military-looking." Sarah almost smiled. If Henderson only knew about the nights she spent maintaining her physical conditioning, the early morning workouts that kept her in better shape than most of the 20-something employees at the company. If he only knew about the mental discipline that allowed her to stay calm under pressure, to solve complex problems under tight deadlines, to lead projects that others found overwhelming. "Mr. Henderson," she said, "I completed Bud/S training with a class of 200 candidates. Only 23 of us graduated. I was one of only 2 women." She could see the doubt in his eyes, but also a growing curiosity. "I spent 4 years in active special operations, including deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. I have a top-secret security clearance that's still active. I speak 3 languages and I have specialized training in psychological operations, which is basically military marketing." Henderson was quiet for a long moment, processing what she was telling him. "Why didn't you ever mention this before?" People tend to react strangely when they find out. Some don't believe it. Others treat you like some kind of science experiment. I learned it was easier to just focus on the work. But you're telling me now because that DoD contract isn't just an opportunity," Sarah said. "It's exactly the kind of work I was trained to do. And if we win it, it could save everyone's jobs." Henderson picked up her presentation and began flipping through it. Sarah watched his expression change as he read her analysis, her insights into military culture, her detailed breakdown of what the Defense Department was really looking for. "This is incredibly thorough," he said after several minutes. "I still have contacts throughout the special operations community," Sarah explained. "I know the people who will be making the decision about this contract. More importantly, I know what they need and I know how to deliver it." Henderson set down the presentation and looked at her with new eyes. "Sarah, if what you're telling me is true, why are you working in marketing?" It was a fair question, one that Sarah had asked herself many times over the past 3 years. "Because after 8 years of military life, I wanted something different," she said. "I wanted to use my skills in a different way, to prove to myself that I could succeed in the civilian world. And honestly, I've enjoyed the work here. You've given me opportunities to grow and learn, and I'm grateful for that. But you think you could help us win this contract?" "I know I can," Sarah said with quiet confidence. Henderson was quiet for another long moment, clearly wrestling with what she had told him. "Sarah, I have to ask, do you have any way to prove what you're saying?" Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather folder. Inside were her military ID, her security clearance documentation, and several commendation letters from her commanding officers. Henderson examined the documents carefully, his expression growing more amazed with each page. "This is..." "Wow," he said finally. "Sarah, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me put together a team to pursue this contract." Sarah replied. Henderson looked at her for a long moment, then back at the documents, then at her presentation. "What would you need?" "Complete autonomy to develop our approach," Sarah said. "Access to our best creative people, and permission to reach out to my military contacts for background information and strategy development." "And you really think we can win?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Goro, Henderson, I've never failed a mission that mattered." For the first time since the Meridian contract fell through, Henderson smiled with genuine optimism. "Then let's get to work," he said. As Sarah left Henderson's office, she felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. After 3 years of hiding her military background, she was about to put it front and center. She would have to trust her colleagues with her true identity, rely on their support, and prove that the quiet marketing consultant they thought they knew was actually someone entirely different. But as she walked back to her desk, Sarah felt more energized than she had in months. She was finally going to be herself again, and she was going to save her team. Word spread through the office like wildfire, though not in the way Sarah had expected. Henderson had asked her to keep the details of her military background confidential while they developed their proposal strategy. But somehow, whispers began circulating that Sarah was working on something big related to the government contract. The first person to approach her was Brad Chen, her cubicle neighbor who had been with the company for 4 years. He appeared at her desk on Wednesday morning with 2 cups of coffee and a curious expression. "So?" he said, setting one of the cups down next to her keyboard. "Henderson's been locked in meetings all week, and Janet mentioned you're leading some kind of special project?" Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. She had been working 12-hour days, researching procurement regulations and developing contact strategies. Her desk was covered with government documents, organizational charts, and pages of handwritten notes that looked nothing like her usual marketing materials. "Something like that," she said carefully. Brad glanced at the papers spread across her workspace. Even upside down, he could see that these weren't typical client briefs or campaign proposals. "This is about that Defense Department thing, isn't it?" Sarah looked up at him. Brad was smart, observant, and had a talent for reading between the lines. He was also someone she had always respected, even if she had never shared much personal information with him. "Why do you ask?" "Because you've been here every morning when I arrive, and you're still here when I leave," Brad said. "And Janet told Maria that Henderson thinks we might actually have a shot at winning some major government work." Sarah saved her document and leaned back in her chair. The truth was, she could use help with certain aspects of the proposal. Her military experience gave her insights into what the Defense Department wanted, but she would need civilian marketing expertise to translate that into compelling presentation materials. "If we were going to pursue a government contract," she said hypothetically, "what would you want to know about it?" He was the kind of person who thrived on challenging projects, especially ones that were outside the company's usual scope. "Everything," he said immediately. "Who's the client? What do they need? Why do they need it? Who are we competing against? What's our unique angle?" Sarah studied his face. Brad was enthusiastic, but she wondered how he would react when he learned about her background. Over the past 3 years, she had observed her colleagues carefully, trying to understand how they thought about military service and the people who chose that path. The reactions were usually mixed. Some people, especially younger employees, seemed to view the military with a combination of respect and bewilderment, as if it was something noble but completely foreign to their experience. Others had political opinions that made them uncomfortable around anyone associated with the defense establishment. But Brad had always struck her as someone who judged people based on their abilities and character rather than their background or affiliations. "The client is the Department of Defense," she said finally. "They need a communications firm that can handle recruitment and public relations for special operations units." Brad whistled softly. That's completely different from anything we've ever done." "Yes, it is. So what makes Henderson think we can compete for something like that?" This was the moment Sarah had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. For 3 years, she had watched Brad struggle with difficult projects, seen him work late nights and weekends to master new skills, observed his frustration when he felt out of his depth on technical accounts. But she had also seen his creativity, his ability to grasp complex concepts quickly, and his talent for translating complicated ideas into clear, compelling narratives. If she was going to trust anyone with her secret, Brad would be a good choice. "Can you keep something confidential?" she asked. Brad nodded seriously. "Before I worked here, I was in the military." "Okay," Brad said, waiting for more information. "I was a Navy SEAL." Brad stared at her for a long moment, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "I'm sorry, what?" "I spent 8 years in the Navy, 4 of them in special operations." Brad set down his coffee cup and looked at her more carefully, as if seeing her for the first time. "Sarah, are you serious?" "Completely serious." "But you're..." "I'm what?" Brad struggled for words. "You're so normal." Sarah laughed despite herself. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone bigger? Someone who talks about blowing things up? Someone who wears camouflage to work?" "That would probably violate the dress code," Sarah said dryly. Brad was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "So when you say Navy SEAL, you mean like actual Navy SEAL? Like jumping out of helicopters and swimming underwater with explosives?" "Among other things, yes." "And now you work in marketing." "I do." Brad shook his head in amazement. "Sarah, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. Why didn't you ever mention it?" Sarah had answered this question several times over the past week, but she was beginning to realize that people's reactions were more positive than she had anticipated. Most people have trouble reconciling military service with civilian work, she said. They either don't believe it, or they treat you like you're some kind of dangerous curiosity. But you're telling me now because you think it can help us win this contract? I'm telling you because I need help, and I think you're someone who can handle the truth. Brad leaned forward, his expression intense. What kind of help? Over the next hour, Sarah outlined her vision for their proposal. The Defense Department wasn't just looking for a marketing firm that could create advertisements and brochures. They needed a partner who could understand the unique culture of special operations, who could communicate effectively with both potential recruits and their families, and who could manage sensitive public relations challenges when missions went wrong or became controversial. Most civilian firms approach military work like it's just another corporate account, Sarah explained. They use the same strategies they would use to sell cars or breakfast cereal. But military culture is completely different. The motivations are different. The values are different. The communication styles are different. Brad was taking notes as she spoke, his mind clearly racing with possibilities. So, our advantage is that we have someone who actually understands that culture from the inside?
Exactly. But I can't do this alone.
I know what the military needs, but I need help translating that into presentations and proposals that will impress civilian contractors and procurement officials. What about the rest of the team? Are you going to tell them? Sarah had been wrestling with this question all week. The proposal would require input from multiple departments: creative, account management, research, strategy. She couldn't complete it working in isolation, but she also wasn't sure how her colleagues would react to learning about her military background. I think I have to, she said. If we're going to win this, everyone needs to understand what makes us different from our competitors. Brad nodded thoughtfully. You know, I think people are going to surprise you. This team respects you, Sarah. They've seen your work. They know you're good at what you do. Learning about your military background isn't going to change that. It's just going to make them respect you more. That afternoon, Henderson called a meeting with the core team that would work on the Defense Department proposal. In addition to Sarah and Brad, he invited Maria Santos from Creative, Janet Walsh from Account Management, and David Kim from Research and Strategy. As they gathered in the small conference room, Sarah could feel her heart rate increasing slightly. These were people she had worked with for 3 years, but they were about to learn something about her that would fundamentally change their perception of who she was. Henderson opened the meeting by explaining the opportunity and the stakes involved. This contract could literally save the company, he said, but it's going to require us to work in a completely different way, on a completely different type of account. He gestured to Sarah. Sarah has been researching the opportunity, and she has some insights that I think will surprise you. Sarah stood up and moved to the whiteboard at the front of the room. As she had learned during military briefings, it was better to deliver important information while standing, making eye contact, and projecting confidence even when you felt nervous. The Department of Defense is looking for a communications firm that can help them recruit and retain special operations personnel, she began. This isn't traditional advertising. It's about understanding a very specific culture and communicating effectively with people who have unique motivations and concerns. She turned to face the team directly. Before I continue, I need to share something with you that I haven't mentioned before. Prior to working here, I spent 8 years in the Navy. 4 of those years were as a Navy SEAL. The room went completely silent. Maria was the first to react. Her eyes widened and she sat back in her chair as if trying to get a better look at Sarah. Wait, what? She said. Janet's mouth had fallen open slightly. David was staring at Sarah with a mixture of amazement and confusion. I know this is surprising, Sarah continued calmly, and I know you probably have questions. But I wanted you to understand why I think we can win this contract and why it's important that we approach it differently than we would approach other accounts. Brad, who had already processed this information, jumped in to provide support. This explains so much, he said, looking around at the others. Haven't you all noticed that Sarah never seems to panic under pressure? That she always has these incredibly detailed project plans? That she can manage the most complicated logistics without breaking a sweat? Maria nodded slowly. Actually, yeah. I always wondered how you stayed so calm during the Meridian crisis last year, because compared to some of the situations I dealt with in the military, client crises are relatively manageable, Sarah said with a slight smile. David raised his hand tentatively. So when you say Navy SEAL, you mean like actual special forces? Like the people who conduct classified operations in dangerous places, yes, Sarah finished for him. That's so cool, Maria exclaimed, then immediately looked embarrassed by her enthusiasm. Janet was still processing the information. Sarah, I have to ask, why didn't you ever mention this? Sarah had been expecting this question. Honestly? Because people react strangely when they find out. Some don't believe it. Others treat you like you're some kind of weapon that might go off unexpectedly. I learned it was easier to just focus on the work. But you're telling us now because, David prompted, because this contract requires exactly the kind of expertise I developed in the military, and because I need your help to win it. Henderson stepped forward. Sarah has put together a preliminary analysis of what the Defense Department is looking for, and it's clear that our usual approach isn't going to work. We need to think like a military organization, not like a traditional marketing firm. Sarah returned to the whiteboard and began outlining her strategy. Special Operations recruitment is facing a crisis, she explained. The traditional warrior archetype isn't attracting enough qualified candidates. They need to reach people who are smart, adaptable, and mentally tough, but who might not see themselves as military material. She drew a diagram showing different demographic groups and their motivations. They also need to communicate with families, especially spouses, who often have concerns about the risks and lifestyle associated with special operations careers, and they need to manage public relations challenges when missions become controversial or when things go wrong. As Sarah continued her briefing, she watched her colleagues' faces transform from surprise to fascination to genuine engagement. They were beginning to understand not just what the Defense Department needed, but how Sarah's unique background positioned them to provide it. The key insight, Sarah concluded, is that special operations isn't just about physical toughness or weapons training. It's about problem-solving under extreme pressure, working effectively in small teams, and adapting to constantly changing situations. Those are skills that exist in many different professions and backgrounds. Maria raised her hand. So our campaign would focus on mental challenges rather than physical ones? We'd be looking for people who thrive on complexity and uncertainty, who want to test themselves against the most difficult problems, who are motivated by mission and purpose rather than just paycheck and benefits. David nodded enthusiastically. That's a completely different approach from the typical military recruitment advertising I've seen, which is why most civilian firms wouldn't understand how to develop it, Janet added, finally seeming to grasp the competitive advantage Sarah was describing. For the next hour, the team brainstormed ideas and approaches. Sarah found herself energized by their enthusiasm and impressed by their ability to grasp concepts that she had worried might be too foreign for civilian marketers to understand. But more importantly, she realized that revealing her military background hadn't damaged her relationships with her colleagues. If anything, it had enhanced them. They were looking at her with new respect, asking questions that showed genuine curiosity rather than discomfort, and building on her ideas in ways that made them stronger. As the meeting wound down, Henderson outlined the timeline for developing their proposal. We have 4 weeks to put together a presentation that will convince the Defense Department to take us seriously, he said. Sarah will lead the effort, with each of you contributing your expertise to different aspects of the proposal. After the others left, Brad lingered behind. So, he said with a grin, how does it feel to finally be yourself at work? For 3 years, she had been performing a version of herself. Competent, reliable, but somehow diminished. She had been hiding the experiences that had shaped her, the skills that defined her, the identity that gave her confidence. It feels, she said finally, like I can finally do my best work. Over the next 2 weeks, the team threw themselves into developing the proposal with an intensity that surprised even Henderson. Sarah's military insights provided the strategic foundation, but each team member contributed something essential to the final product. Maria developed creative concepts that were unlike anything the Defense Department had seen before. recruitment materials that focused on intellectual challenges and personal growth rather than weapons and explosions. Her designs were sophisticated and compelling, appealing to college graduates and young professionals who might never have considered military service. David conducted research that revealed gaps in current recruitment strategies and identified demographic groups that were being underserved by existing approaches. His data analysis provided the quantitative foundation that would convince procurement officials that their approach was based on solid evidence. Janet developed client service protocols that accounted for the unique requirements of government work, security procedures, approval processes, and communication standards that were completely different from their commercial accounts. Brad worked with Sarah to translate military concepts into language that civilian decision-makers could understand, creating presentations that were both authentic to special operations culture and accessible to procurement committees. But the real breakthrough came when Sarah arranged for the team to visit a local Navy facility for what she called cultural immersion. Using her security clearance and military contacts, Sarah set up a day-long session where her colleagues could observe actual special operations training, speak with current SEAL candidates, and understand firsthand what they were trying to recruit for. The experience was transformative. Maria watched candidates navigate complex problem-solving scenarios and realized that physical fitness was actually secondary to mental agility and teamwork. David observed the diversity of backgrounds among successful candidates and understood that their recruitment message needed to be much broader than traditional military advertising suggested. Janet witnessed the intensity of the training environment and grasped why families needed specialized support and communication. Brad spent time with instructors and learned how they identified candidates who had the psychological resilience to succeed in high-pressure situations. By the end of the day, the entire team had a visceral understanding of what made special operations unique, and their proposal ideas became more sophisticated and authentic. But Sarah's colleagues also gained something else, a deeper appreciation for what their quiet coworker had actually accomplished. Watching current SEAL candidates struggle through training exercises that Sarah had completed years earlier, seeing the respect that active duty personnel showed her, understanding the level of expertise required to succeed in that environment. It all combined to give them a new perspective on the person they thought they knew. "I had no idea," Maria said as they drove back to the office. "I mean, I knew it was impressive when you told us, but seeing it firsthand. It's like working with a superhero who's been disguised as a mild-mannered marketing consultant," Brad added. "Trust me, it's not as dramatic as it looks. Most of military life is actually pretty routine. Planning, training, paperwork, more planning. But the stuff that isn't routine," David said, "that's what makes the difference." As they neared the office, Janet asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Sarah, do you miss it? The military life?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "I miss parts of it," she said finally. "I miss the clarity of purpose, the sense that what you're doing really matters. I miss working with people who are completely committed to the mission." "But," Brad prompted, "but I also appreciate the opportunity to use my skills in a different way. And working with all of you on this project, it's reminded me that mission focus and commitment exists in civilian life too. They just look different." As they pulled into the company parking lot, Sarah realized something had fundamentally changed in her relationship with her colleagues. She was no longer the quiet consultant who kept her background secret. She was Sarah Mitchell, former Navy SEAL, current marketing strategist, and leader of the most important project in the company's history. The question now was whether their proposal would be enough to convince the Defense Department that a small marketing firm led by a former SEAL could outperform established government contractors with decades of experience. In 2 weeks, they would find out. The proposal presentation was scheduled for a Friday morning at the Pentagon. Sarah had arranged for the entire team to receive temporary security clearances and visitor passes, but as the day approached, the magnitude of what they were attempting became increasingly clear. They weren't just competing for a contract. They were trying to convince one of the world's most bureaucratic organizations to take a chance on an unconventional approach proposed by people who had never worked in government contracting. But Sarah had been in impossible situations before, and she had never failed a mission that truly mattered. The Pentagon is an intimidating place under the best of circumstances. As Sarah and her team approached the enormous building on that Friday morning in November, even she felt a flutter of nervousness that she hadn't experienced in years. Security checkpoints, escort requirements, and maze-like corridors filled with uniformed personnel. It was a world that Sarah knew well, but one that was completely foreign to her civilian colleagues. She watched Brad's eyes widen as they passed displays of military hardware and walls covered with portraits of four-star generals. Maria kept checking and rechecking her visitor badge, clearly overwhelmed by the formality and security protocols. "Stay close and follow my lead," Sarah whispered as their military escort led them through the corridors. "Remember, these are just people doing their jobs. They want to find the right solution as much as we want to provide it." But even Sarah felt the weight of what they were attempting as they approached the conference room where they would make their presentation. Through her military contacts, she had learned that they were competing against 3 established defense contractors, each with decades of government experience and multi-million-dollar contracts already in their portfolios. Henderson Marketing Group was the dark horse, the small civilian firm with no track record in government work, led by a woman whose military credentials most people still couldn't quite believe. The presentation room contained 12 people seated around a polished conference table. Sarah recognized some of them from her active duty days. Senior officers responsible for special operations recruitment and retention. Others were civilian procurement officials and contract administrators who would evaluate proposals based on compliance, cost-effectiveness, and demonstrated capability. At the head of the table sat Captain Rebecca Torres, the Navy's Director of Special Operations Personnel Management. Sarah had never worked directly with Torres, but she knew her reputation. She was brilliant, demanding, and completely intolerant of presentations that wasted her time with generic solutions or corporate buzzwords. "Good morning," Torres said as the team took their seats. "We appreciate you taking the time to present your proposal. As you know, special operations recruitment and retention has become one of our highest priorities, and we're looking for innovative approaches that can help us reach qualified candidates who might not respond to traditional military advertising." She gestured to Sarah. "Ms. Gray. Mitchell, I understand you'll be leading the presentation." Sarah stood up and moved to the front of the room. She had decided to begin with their most unconventional idea, the one that would either capture the committee's attention immediately or convince them that Henderson Marketing Group was completely wrong for the job. "Captain Torres, distinguished members of the committee," she began, "I want to start by showing you something that represents everything that's wrong with current special operations recruitment." She clicked to her first slide, which showed a typical military recruitment advertisement. The image featured a muscular young man in camouflage carrying an assault rifle with text that read, "Do you have what it takes?" "This is the advertisement that ran in major magazines last year," Sarah continued. "It generated thousands of inquiries and hundreds of applications. But do you know how many of those applicants actually completed SEAL training?" She paused for effect. 3. Several committee members shifted in their chairs. Sarah had their attention. "The problem isn't that we're not reaching enough people," she continued. "The problem is that we're reaching the wrong people. We're attracting candidates who are drawn to the Hollywood image of special operations, but we're missing the people who actually have the mental and psychological characteristics to succeed." She clicked to her next slide, which showed a different kind of advertisement. Instead of weapons and camouflage, it featured a complex puzzle with text that read, "Some problems can only be solved by the best minds." Instead of appealing to people who want to be warriors, we're targeting people who want to solve impossible problems. Instead of focusing on physical toughness, we're emphasizing intellectual challenge and personal growth. Captain Torres leaned forward slightly. "Miss Mitchell, that's an interesting theory, but how do you know it will work?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Because I know what actually makes someone successful in special operations, and it's not what most people think." She turned to face the committee directly. "Before I joined Henderson Marketing Group 3 years ago, I spent 8 years in the Navy. 4 of those years were as an active duty SEAL." The reaction was immediate and varied. Several committee members nodded with recognition. They had obviously been briefed about Sarah's background. But the civilian procurement officials looked skeptical, and one man near the end of the table actually laughed quietly. Sarah continued without acknowledging the reaction. "During my time in special operations, I worked with hundreds of SEAL candidates and dozens of fully qualified operators. The people who succeeded weren't necessarily the biggest or the strongest or the most aggressive. They were the people who could think clearly under pressure, who could adapt quickly to changing situations, and who were motivated by something deeper than personal glory. She clicked to a new slide showing demographic data that David had compiled. Our research indicates that the most successful SEAL candidates often have backgrounds in engineering, computer science, medicine, or other problem-solving professions. They're people who are already proven performers in high-pressure environments, but who are looking for a new kind of challenge. Brad stood up to join the presentation, his nervousness evident, but his voice steady. The traditional military recruitment approach tries to convince people to become something they're not, he said. Our approach identifies people who already have the core characteristics needed for success and shows them how special operations can be the ultimate expression of their existing skills. Maria moved to the front of the room and began displaying the creative materials they had developed. Instead of the typical military advertising imagery, their concepts looked more like recruitment materials for a high-tech startup or elite graduate program. "We're not trying to create warriors," she explained. "We're trying to identify people who are already warriors in their own fields, whether that's trauma surgery, software development, or emergency response, and show them how those same skills can be applied to special operations." The committee was clearly engaged now. Questions began flying from different directions. How do you measure success with this approach? What about physical fitness standards? How do you address family concerns about deployment and risk? For the next hour, Sarah and her team answered questions with the kind of detailed knowledge that only comes from real experience and thorough preparation. Sarah drew on her military background to explain operational realities. David provided research data that supported their strategic recommendations. Janet outlined client service protocols that addressed the unique requirements of government work, but it was Maria's creative presentation that seemed to have the biggest impact. Traditional military advertising shows people what they might become, she explained, displaying a series of mock-up advertisements. Our approach shows people what they already are and invites them to take it to the next level. One advertisement featured a photograph of an emergency room doctor with the headline, "You've saved lives under pressure. Are you ready for the ultimate challenge?" Another showed a software engineer with the text, "You solve problems that others say are impossible. We have some new problems for you." A third featured a mountain rescue specialist with the message, "You already risk everything to help others. What if you could do more?" Captain Torres studied the creative materials carefully. "This is completely different from anything we've seen before." "That's the point," Sarah said. "If you keep doing the same things, you'll keep getting the same results. Our approach is designed to reach people who would never respond to traditional military recruitment, but who have exactly the characteristics you need." One of the civilian procurement officials raised his hand. "Miss Mitchell, I have to ask. Your company has no track record with government contracts. How do we know you can actually execute on these ideas?" It was the question Sarah had been expecting and dreading. On paper, Henderson Marketing Group looked like a risky choice compared to their established competitors. But Sarah had prepared for this moment. "You're absolutely right that we don't have a track record with government contracts," she said. "But we have something that's much more valuable. We have actual understanding of what you're trying to accomplish." She turned to the whiteboard behind her and began sketching a diagram. "Every other firm that's presented to you today will promise to learn about special operations culture. But I lived that culture for 8 years. Every other firm will promise to research your target demographic. But I am your target demographic." She drew connections between different elements of their strategy. "More importantly, my team has spent the past month immersed in current special operations training. They've observed candidate selection processes, interviewed current operators, and developed first-hand understanding of what makes someone successful in this environment." Brad stepped forward to support her point. "When Sarah first told us about her military background, I'll be honest, I was amazed. But after spending time at the training facility, after seeing what SEAL candidates actually go through, I realized that we've been working with someone truly extraordinary for 3 years without knowing it." He turned to face the committee. "Sarah doesn't just understand special operations intellectually. She's lived it, succeeded in it, and now she's applying that experience to solve your recruitment challenges. No other firm can offer you that combination of authentic experience and modern marketing expertise. Captain Torres was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. Mitchell, I have to ask you a personal question. You successfully completed SEAL training, served with distinction in special operations, and then left to work in civilian marketing. Why would you want to come back and work with the military again? Sarah had known this question would come up eventually. It went to the heart of her motivations and would help the committee understand whether she was genuinely committed to their mission. Ma'am, I left active duty because I wanted to prove to myself that I could succeed in a different environment. I wanted to develop new skills and gain different perspectives. But I've never stopped caring about the special operations community or the mission we serve. She gestured to her team. Working on this proposal has reminded me why I chose military service in the first place. It's not about personal glory or adventure. It's about being part of something bigger than yourself, about using your abilities to make a difference in situations that really matter. Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. The recruitment crisis facing special operations isn't just a staffing problem. It's a threat to our national security capabilities. If we can't attract and retain the best people, we can't maintain the elite units that our country depends on for the most critical missions. She met Torres' gaze directly. This isn't just a business opportunity for us, it's a chance to help solve a problem that I care deeply about using skills that I've spent my entire career developing. The room was completely quiet for several seconds. Then Captain Torres smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her during the entire presentation. Mitchell, I have one more question. If we award this contract to your firm, and you're successful in changing our recruitment approach, what happens to you personally? Do you go back to marketing breakfast cereal and consumer products? Sarah looked around at her team, at Brad, who had become her strongest supporter, at Maria, whose creativity had brought their ideas to life, at David, whose research had given their strategy credible foundation, at Janet, who had guided them through the complexities of government procurement. Ma'am, I've discovered that the most important missions aren't always the ones that involve jumping out of airplanes or swimming underwater with explosives. Sometimes the most important mission is helping other people discover what they're capable of accomplishing. She gestured to her colleagues. Working with this team has reminded me that leadership and mission focus can exist anywhere. If we win this contract, I won't be going back to my old job. I'll be continuing to grow in a role that combines everything I've learned in both military and civilian life. Torres nodded slowly. Thank you for your presentation. We'll be making our decision within 2 weeks, and we'll notify all candidates by phone. As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. They had done everything they could. The rest was out of their hands. But as they walked through the Pentagon corridors toward the exit, Captain Torres caught up with them. Mitchell, she said quietly, could I speak with you privately for a moment? Sarah's heart rate increased slightly. Private conversations after presentations could mean anything. Torres led her to a small alcove away from the main corridor traffic. I want you to know that your presentation was remarkable, Torres said. Not just the strategy and creative work, though. Those were impressive. But the authenticity. Most contractors try to tell us what they think we want to hear. You told us what we need to hear. Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. I also want you to know that there are people in this building who remember your service record, Torres continued. Your former commanding officers spoke very highly of your capabilities and your character. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The decision about this contract will be made based on multiple factors: strategy, cost, capability, and risk assessment. But I can tell you that your team has presented an approach that's unlike anything we've ever seen. Whether or not you win this particular contract, you've given us ideas that will influence our thinking going forward. As they rejoined the team and left the Pentagon, Sarah reflected on how much had changed over the past month. 4 weeks earlier, she had been hiding her military background, treating it like an embarrassing secret that might damage her civilian career. Now she had led her team into the Pentagon itself, used her military experience as the foundation for their most important business proposal, and discovered that her colleagues respected her more, not less, for sharing her authentic background. The drive back to the office was quiet. Everyone was emotionally drained from the intensity of the presentation. But there was also an undercurrent of excitement. They had accomplished something remarkable. A small marketing firm had competed on equal terms with established government contractors, and they had done it by leveraging the unique background of a colleague who had been hiding her capabilities for 3 years. 2 weeks later, Sarah was working late on a client proposal when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number with a 703 area code, Northern Virginia, where the Pentagon was located. Sarah Mitchell. "Mitchell, this is Captain Torres. Do you have a moment to talk?" Sarah's pulse quickened. "Of course. I'm calling to inform you that Henderson Marketing Group has been selected to receive the Department of Defense Special Operations recruitment contract." Sarah sat down heavily in her chair, momentarily speechless. "Mitchell, are you there? Are you there?" "I'm here. I'm just surprised." Torres laughed. "Don't be too surprised. Your proposal was exactly what we were looking for, even if we didn't know it at the time." As Torres explained the next steps in the contracting process, Sarah looked around the office. Most of her colleagues had gone home for the day, but she could see Brad still working at his desk across the room. "Captain Torres," she said, "I want you to know that my entire team contributed to this success. I may have the military background, but they're the ones who turned that into a winning strategy." "I understand that," Torres replied, "and we're looking forward to working with all of you." After the call ended, Sarah walked over to Brad's cubicle. "We won," she said simply. Brad looked up from his computer, his expression changing from concentration to amazement. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious." Brad stood up and hugged her, something that would have been unthinkable 4 weeks earlier, when Sarah was still the quiet colleague who kept her background secret. "Sarah, this is incredible. Do you realize what this means?" Sarah did realize what it meant. It meant that Henderson Marketing Group would survive and grow. It meant that her colleagues would keep their jobs and have opportunities to work on challenging, meaningful projects. It meant that the Defense Department would get the innovative recruitment approach they needed. But more personally, it meant that Sarah had finally learned to integrate all aspects of her identity. She was no longer the former SEAL trying to hide in the civilian world, or the marketing consultant pretending her military experience didn't matter. She was Sarah Mitchell, former Navy SEAL, current marketing strategist, and leader of a team that had just accomplished something extraordinary. Over the next few months, as they began implementing their recruitment strategy, Sarah's colleagues would have many opportunities to see her military training in action. They would watch her manage complex logistics, navigate bureaucratic challenges, and maintain focus under pressure, in ways that reminded them daily that their quiet coworker was someone truly exceptional. But they would also see her continue to grow and learn, adapting her military skills to civilian challenges and discovering new capabilities that emerged from combining her diverse experiences. The woman who had once hidden her military background had become someone who could seamlessly integrate all aspects of her identity, using every part of her experience to tackle new challenges and lead others to achieve things they had never thought possible. The room had not only gone silent and stood up metaphorically. In the months that followed, Sarah would find herself in actual rooms where military personnel would literally stand when she entered, showing the respect that her authentic service and continued excellence had earned. But the real victory wasn't the recognition or the contract, or even the saved jobs. The real victory was that Sarah had learned to be completely herself in every environment, bringing all of her capabilities and experience to bear on whatever challenge she faced. She had stopped hiding and started leading, and in doing so, she had shown her team, her company, and herself what was possible when someone finally embraced everything they were capable of becoming. Sarah Mitchell had always been extraordinary. She had just finally learned to let other people see it.